Hey folks, I am back for week two of recording myself. I can say that it's really nothing that I particularly enjoy. Watching myself on videos that I've made um, is frankly disappointing. Well, anyway, here we are. So, for those that have decided to watch the video, thanks so much. I hope this will be helpful. I'm going to race through things pretty quickly in two videos. This will be the longer one, and then the next one will be somewhat shorter. For those that have chosen not to watch the video, I don't know why I'm saying anything to you because you're not watching the video. All right, anyway, here we go. So, we're going to talk about the Mexican Revolution. Recall that last week we talked about the Haitian Revolution. Mexico is our second case study in our Latin America sequence. That Latin America sequence is going to be looking at questions of hierarchy, status, inequality, and increasingly the role that the United States plays in reinforcing or addressing in some form or fashion that inequality. And we'll see that very much so in the Mexican Revolution. Our next segment, not today, but next week, will be on Guatemala, and we'll see a very heavy presence of the United States in the events of 1954. Um, you'll notice the dates 1910 and 1920. Those are the dates of the active fighting phase of the Mexican Revolution, the military phase. We're going to actually extend a little bit beyond 1920 and look at sort of the after effects and when the revolution really um, took hold as far as the ideas really took hold in Mexico. But we'll begin really with this 10-year period. You'll note, I'm sure, that those years were also overlapping with the First World War. Remember the Zimmermann telegram that Mexico refused Germany's invitation to attack the United States and side with Germany, in part because Mexico was involved in its own tumult, that is, its revolution. All right, let's move ahead here. Oh gosh, these slides are not working. Let's try that. And yeah, all right, not working. Is that? Oh yeah, no. Okay. Hopefully this will continue to work better than not. Let's start with 1994. Just about 24 years ago, there was a group called the Zapatistas, or their army was referred to as the EZLN, the Ejército Zapatista Liberation Nacional. That's some mediocre pronunciation of Spanish. All that to say that an army of mostly peasants, campesinos, mostly Mayan people who lived in rural villages. They owned little to nothing. They were more or less dispossessed, as they had been for centuries. Had A number of them had grouped in the Lacandon jungle. This is really in southern Mexico, mostly situated in the state of Chiapas, which has a very um, large number of indigenous people. Unlike United States, which Mexico does share some resemblance to in many ways, um, but is very different in many other ways. The indigenous population of Mexico has a much larger public presence. If you're a tourist in Mexico, and I don't mean Baja California or resort towns, most likely you'll see some of the indigenous heritage and life of indigenous people in Mexico. So that dispossession had continued for centuries, and in 1994, taking the name of Emiliano Zapata, who had been a revolutionary hero in the period that we're going to study, a group broke out of the jungle in the 1990s to revolt yet once again. All right, let's move on from there. All that to remind us that Mexico had for centuries, like all Latin America, been essentially a society based on great division around class and race, and that was a theme in Haiti. It's certainly a theme in Mexico as well. That inequality will become especially pronounced by the late 19th century, during a time of which a man named Porfirio Diaz became president. The period of time he ruled, which was over about 30 years, was actually named after him. He had such a heavy impact on the country and had such a iron-fisted presence. Um, that the name of the period of time which he ruled was called the Porfiriato, named after Porfirio Diaz. It's not only marked by tremendous inequality, but it's also time when the United States takes a much larger role uh, in the events of Mexico. And then we'll more or less conclude, or no, we won't conclude. We'll start actually initially talking about an important US policy called the Monroe Doctrine, which will assert, the Americans will assert their right to intervene throughout Latin America to prevent any European influence, but it sets the stage for massive American presence um, really up to this day. So let's get started here. Just a quick reminder, we looked at those casta paintings at the beginning of our Latin America unit while we were still physically in school. You see some from Mexico as well. Remember, the Spaniards created this propaganda art form to reinforce one's place in society. And so we see the role of an Indian here. This is someone with a little bit more status, a Consteño, person from the coast. Um, Again, we don't have to go through all of these, but you'll notice that each of these little scenes establishes what the proper dress and attire and social role and social relationships are for these different castes to really um, uh, establish and reinforce the notion of hierarchy. All right, I mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, and you'll have a chance to look at these slides. You can look a little bit more closely at the cartoons, but there is the United States across, what represents essentially the Atlantic Ocean, as these elite Europeans are looking on, and they're saying, Uncle Sam is saying, no, this is our territory. Latin America is our purview, and we have the right to do what we want here, and you don't. Another version of that here is Teddy Roosevelt leading a bunch of toy ships around the Caribbean with his big stick. Uh, he was referred to as having the big stick policy. That is, he'll use that stick if needed to impose American will in the region. So that's important. You'll read just a little bit about that in the readings this week. In 1848, then, the United States goes to war against Mexico. That's a complicated event that involves several factors. But the main thing I want you to take away from that is that by the end of that war, Mexico had lost at least 1/3 of its territory. You can see the map on the left, referred to as New Spain or Mexico, had territory that later, in the map on the right, becomes part of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. And that, of course, is more or less the map today. So already we see an increasing American presence in the region. All right, I mentioned this period called the Porfiriato, beginning in 1876, ending in 1911. This guy here, looking a bit stodgy, is Porfirio Diaz, who ruled Mexico as a president. That's a long time to be president in a republic or representative government. But one could really argue that he was a dictator. So he takes control by force in 1876. I'm not going to go through every single note. You have access to these. But the basic thing is he wanted to modernize or industrialize Mexico. He needed money. He didn't have it. He invited the Americans to invest in railroads, bridges, trade, technology, and most importantly, eventually the United States and the British will build the oil industry. Mexico has a lot of oil, which has proven to be perhaps its biggest and most important export. We'll see at this time the building of wealth, which is good in general, except that it was restricted to a very small share of people. And we see a pronounced growth of inequality. Diaz is corrupt. He's going to essentially deliver this these profits of this new investment to his cronies, who in exchange for wealth and land, they just promise to continue to vote for him and keep him in power. So it's a time of corruption. It's a time of great inequality where the indigenous or Indian population, campesinos, stay poor. Just as a kind of emblem of that time is this building, the Bellas Artes, this stunning music and art hall. It represents the lavish spending of the time. but that was really only for the benefit of certain people. Um, yeah. Okay, let's move on there. If I can. Oh, oh gosh, it's getting stuck again. All right, come on. All right. So the revolution begins in earnest when this guy, Francisco Madero, um, uh, declares that Mexico needs a constitution and Diaz should leave. He's corrupt. It's not good for the country. Diaz's policy was sort of referred to as pan o palo. You get bread if you support me, you get the stick if you don't. And he's handing out lots of land and wealth, or haciendas, large plantations, basically, to his cronies again. Madero calls to overthrow him. A bunch of militias are formed, not just one, and the revolution begins in earnest. Diaz has the wisdom to step down, although recall he'd been in power since 1876. A couple key figures to know. One is Emiliano Zapata. Again, the Zapatistas took their name from Emiliano Zapata. They would call themselves the Zapatistas back in the early 20th century, just as they do in 1990s, up until to this day. His major call was for Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty. And you might actually remember there was a picture of him up by the door in room 346. He has one major goal, that's in his state, the state of Morelos. He wants to protect indigenous lands, campesino lands, and break up the haciendas. It's basically a land reform program to take land that's concentrated in the hands of a few, divide it to the poor and the people that really need it. He's assassinated towards the end of the revolution. The other figure who's based further up north is Pancho Villa. There's a little statuette of Villa also in the filing cabinet in room 346. He basically was a bandit, a Robin Hood type who smuggled and robbed from the United States and from others. He organized more people who were more associated with the industrial economy, unlike Zapata, who was more associated with campesinos and rural peasants. But basically, he ran an army and raided and caused mayhem and tried to break up a lot of haciendas. He also was assassinated after the revolution. Now, you don't have to know this guy's name, Carranza, except that he wrote the new Constitution of Mexico in 1917, so towards the end of the military period. All right, this Constitution, although he himself was a pretty moderate guy, he was against Zapata, who was too radical for him, against Pancho Villa, nevertheless wrote a fairly progressive constitution. Number one, it would try to put a check or a limit on foreign influence like the United States, which we'll get back to. He wanted to protect workers and establish more better protections for unions. And he allowed peasants to claim lands that were not in use. The revolution more or less ends. This constitution exists, but it's not really put into force. And Mexico kind of slides a little bit back towards a form of dictatorship, particularly under this guy, Plutarco Elias Calles, who, like Porfirio Diaz, had so much power that a period of time under which he ruled or which he controlled others ruling also got the whole period of time named after him. His nickname was the Jefe Maximo, the big boss. And so this period of time is referred to the Maximato, which is crazy. It'd be like having an American president who, put his name on buildings and named things after him. All right, anyway, he promises reform, but really he just uses the unions to bring votes to him and the other candidates he likes. And he kind of keeps successive rulers under his control. Eventually, this guy's elected, and Calles is sure that Lázaro Cárdenas would also be a puppet. But Cárdenas, one of the first things he does is he kicks Calles out of the country. Cárdenas is a true reformer. So even though the fighting of the revolution had ended, this is when the reforms and the ideas of the revolution really begin to take hold. He's going to reinforce that 1917 Constitution. He's going to exile or force Calles out of the country to the United States. He's going to transfer 50 million acres of land to peasants who desperately need it. He's going to improve conditions in the factories and the mines. He's going to strengthen the unions. And here's the real big thing that he is perhaps best known for and is really regarded as a hero at the time. He nationalizes the oil industry. That is to say, he expropriates or transfers ownership of the oil industry from Mexican and British corporate hands into, no, to American and British hands, from American and British hands into Mexican hands. He pays the Americans, he pays the British. In fact, so many people love this idea that poor people across the country donated money and belongings just to pay for the transfer of ownership. He was truly celebrated, and this made oil really part of the national identity of Mexico. It was part of its ability to stay strong and have a powerful economy. Okay, whoops, that's it. So I'm going to stop there and look for the next video in the document. Thanks.